Hello and welcome to Chapter 12, Installing Windows. So in today's chapter, we are going over how to prepare a hard drive and set it up to install Windows. You could install Windows 7, 8, or 10. Um, so take good notes. There's a very good chance you'll be doing that in the future if you start as a help desk, for example. Anyway, so don't forget the notes that I'm going to ask you to take, and so you can submit them as homework. All right. What I did is what I want you to do. I summarized the first section not the first sections, a few pages down in here. So please write these down. All right. So couple of things. Know the definition that OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturers. So there's two licenses that Microsoft gives out, the OEM and the retail. The OEM can be installed on new computers, used for builders, typically like Dell or HP. They purchase an OEM. It's a little bit cheaper than getting the retail. All right. And it allows for all hardware upgrades. So you don't really deal with OEM licenses. You're going to be dealing with a retail license. You purchase directly from Microsoft. You can download. So you can either download or they'll send you the CD. You can transfer it to other PCs, by the way. They don't used to do that in the old days. But now if, let's say, your hard drive crashes, you can reinstall Windows on a new hard drive as long as it's registered with Microsoft. All right. And you get direct Microsoft support. So that's a good reason why you want to have a legal license installed on your machine. All right. Now we're talking about, let's say we're just talking about Windows 10. There are a 32-bit and a 64-bit architecture. All right. So what is the difference? You need to know that. And first of all, don't purchase a 64-bit operating system unless you have a 64-bit CPU. And we talked about that on the last chapter. Just go to System Information to find out what type of CPU architecture that you have on your machine. You're probably better off, of course, if you have a 64-bit, is to get a 64-bit operating system. If you have a 64-bit CPU and you want a 32-bit, you could do that if you want to. But a 32-bit CPU, you cannot run Windows 64-bit on it because 64-bit supports 64. It's faster. It supports 64-bit applications. You must have enough memory because there's a minimum amount of memory that you can have. And even though you install 32-bit application on a 64-bit, it is best to always use the 64-bit app. All right. Also, I want you to write down now the minimum requirements and the maximum amount of RAM that you'll get depending on which type of operating system you choose, a 32 or a 64. 32-bit architecture, you can get Windows 10 Home, Pro, or Enterprise at a 32-bit, and a 64-bit, you can also get Windows 8 Pro, Enterprise, and Windows 10 as well. Of course, Windows 10 and 8. All right, so we're primarily going to be talking about Windows, really. You don't have to worry about the 8. I'm just going to get rid of that. We're talking about 10 primarily. All right, for Windows 10 or Home or 8.1, for any 32-bit operating system, you need it can give you a maximum of 4 gigabytes of RAM. Here, they can access up to 128 gigs of RAM. So if you have a 64-bit operating system, you can have on your machine 128 gigabytes of RAM, which is good. For Windows 10 or the Pro, you can get up to 512. Have a terabyte of RAM on your machine if you're running a 64-bit Pro version of Windows 10, which is good. The minimum processor, you need 1 gigahertz for any 32-bit, 1 gigahertz also for 64-bit. The minimum RAM requirement to install the app, 1 gigabyte for 32-bit, 2 gigabyte for a 64-bit. the minimum hard drive space. You need 16 gigabyte for a 32-bit and a 20 gigabyte for a 64. And you need a minimum of a video device and driver. Direct 9 is what you need for both of them, for a 32-bit and a 64-bit. All right, so once you are done with that, we can move on to the chapter. So let's talk about the two methods to partition the hard drive. In the old ways, we used to partition the hard drive using the master boot record. This allowed us to have 4 partitions, a maximum, and with the MBR, please write those down. So the two methods to partition the hard drives, you have the MBR, the master boot record. This is old, not used anymore, but it allowed us to have 4 partitions, and the maximum hard drive that it can detect is 2.2 terabyte hard drive. The newer method is called the GUID partition table, GPT, allows up to 128 partitions, and it requires for a hard drive to have higher than 2.2 terabytes. So if you purchase a hard drive that is more than 2.2 terabyte, you're going to have to use the GPT partitioning. What is a partition? It's an area that you will place data on the hard drive. So when you purchase a hard drive, you just got an area. It is not formatted to place data on it. So when you partition it, you set the boundaries of where the area you're going to place the data in. So MBR, you can create 4 areas. 3 of them could be primary, which means you can have multi-boot, which we'll discuss that in a multi-boot. 3 different operating systems could be stored on your system in 3 primary partition, and the last one will be logical, just like a regular drive, just to save data. With GPT, you can have 128 partitions. Okay? All right. Partitions must be high-level formatted. So when you set the boundaries of the space that you want to place data on your drive, that's called a partition. You have to do high-level formatting. So when you do high-level formatting, the first thing that's going to happen, write that down. That's when you format a hard drive. It's going to erase all the data in the partition if there's anything in there. Places a file system in the boot sector. File system is the NTFS or FAT32 and exFAT. We'll discuss more of that on the next chapter. And it's going to give the drive a letter C, for example. All right. When you do install Windows 10, it places kernel files. Here you go. The kernel files, the core OSBF files in a boot sector. The rest of the operating system is placed on the hard drive. The system BIOS, UEFI, and device drivers for the hard drives on the motherboard and the video board always communicate with the kernel. Kernel is the guy who communicates with the hardware on the system, and the user interface is, communicates with the shell. Applications and users communicate with the shell of the operating system. The kernel communicates with the hardware. So they're kind of separated. But again, we'll get into this more on the next chapter. All right. When you cold boot the system, what happened? I want to make sure you understand this. So please write the following step. I don't think your book goes over them in details, but here's what happened when you cold boot the system. Cold boot means you turn on the power. You don't it's not reload. Reload or restart, that's warm boot, it's called. Okay, when you cold boot the system, what happens? 3 steps. Number 1, start up BIOS, EUFI, the basic input-output system, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, that's what that stands for, the BIOS UEFI, starts the post. So that's the first time. The post runs, post stands for Power On Self-Test. And the Power On Self-Test are several diagnostic programs that run or test the hardware of the PC. So post runs first from the BIOS. The second thing from the BIOS, another program called Bootstrap. Bootstrap goes and looks for the operating system and loads it. So there's a boot sequence that's located in the BIOS. So the Bootstrap goes and looks at the looks at the boot sequence, and it says, okay, where am I going to go and look for the operating system to load it? It may go to the DVD and then to maybe USB, and finally we'll get it from the hard drive. Once the operating system is found and loaded into memory, then the operating system takes over. Okay? So those are the 3 steps. Before installing your hard drive, okay, you guys know how to get into the BIOS by pressing delete file or F12. Remember that? We discussed that on the last semester, on the last chapter. All right, so what do you need to do before installing your hard drive? So, okay, so the choices that you need to make. Number 1, check for, before you even do any installation, check for driver compatibility, okay? Decide if you want an upgrade, clean, or dual boot. Remember, an upgrade means you already have an operating system that's lower than the ones that let's say you want to upgrade 8.1 to 10, you could do that. Clean means you don't have any operating system on the machine. Dual boot means you want to have more than one operating system, which means you're going to have 2 different partitions at least. All right, so decide if you want multi-boot. Each operating system should have its own partition. Upgrade, make sure 32 goes to 32 bits, 64-bit operating system, you can only upgrade it to 64. You can't do 32 to 64 and 64 to 32. That doesn't work. All right. The size of the partitions. Don't use the hard drive as one partition, one big partition. It's always a good idea to break it up into a few partitions, because the larger the partitions, the bigger the file system is going to be, and the longer probably, especially for the magnetic drive, takes time to retrieve the files. Check the network. What type of network connection are you going to have? Wireless or wired? Make sure you know the name of the wireless SSID if you need to, because you're going to be asked to connect during the installation. All right, and check the table on 638. So if we go to 638, which is right here, this is going to tell us everything that we need to know about all the questions you need to have answered before you start your installation. All right. Make sure Windows has a valid product key and is activated. If the hard drive or the motherboard fails, just install a hard drive and you don't need to worry about the product key. It's going as long as you are physically connected. You can even, worst case scenario, contact Microsoft, and you should have that product key somewhere and registered with Microsoft, because you're getting your update, and you should be okay. As long as you're connected to the internet, you should be fine. After installation, all right, install the device drivers. Make sure Windows, Defender, antivirus, and the firewalls are also active. All right, you got to double check that. Install applications as needed. Turn off or on the Windows features. All right, so you may need to add new features. Some applications like Hyper-V, for example. All right. Hyper-V is the hypervisor that allows you to install VMs, okay, in the new virtual machines. All right. I'm going to stop right here, and then we're going to talk about, we'll take off with deploying, creating standard images and things like that. All right. So write down what I asked you to write down, and we'll continue with part 2 on the next video. Don't forget to submit the notes I asked you to write for homework.